I was hoping to get a little better of a sense of what led you to join the courses and what you're hoping to get out of them. And then of course, address some of your questions in the short time that we have together.
So what led me to your courses, I found you online, and I was taking the Kaplan course, and I was dissatisfied with the commercial course. I needed something geared more towards people who want a higher score and take the effort to gear themselves instead of towards like the baseline. And I noticed that a lot of your emails address that. Like, here's the basics. If you're looking for a higher score, then try this, try this. That's really what led me to now when I was starting to restudy for the retest. So that's when I signed on with your course.
Excellent. Great. And what would you say is the biggest insight you've gotten out of the courses so far?
So one very interesting, I'm only spending more time so far on the logic games. One very important thing is don't pay any attention to what the game says. Just think of in terms of the entities and the diagrams that you're going to use. For example, if you're going to space, I'm not in space. I'm sitting on my computer and I'm writing it down. As long as you just get, if it's a linear graph, if it's whatever your type of diagram I'm going to use, but don't get caught up at all in the game.
Nice. Awesome. I love it. Yeah. The topic never really matters on the LSAT, does it?
No.
So excellent. So I saw you've got some questions here for me, and we'll cover as many as we can today. What would you say is the biggest thing on your mind right now, where if we address this question, it could change absolutely everything for you with your prep? What's the number one thing going on for you right now?
Just most of the time right now, I'm not timing it properly, but most of the time I'm getting all the questions right, but only like sometime during the game, like 2 or 3 questions in, like I get that question, that inference that opens the game up. I need to be able to get that earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So to be fair, sometimes you will not always get an inference at the beginning. There are some global must be true questions. And of course, a global must be true question indicates that it might have been possible for you to make that inference up front, but it's such a random little thing that it might not have even occurred to you, nor is it necessarily that significant overall. So I might actually push back with you a little bit on that and say, maybe you don't need to know it up front. And what can you do in the cases where you don't get it up front? Because in the comfort of your own home or your office, when you know it's not the real thing, the stakes are not as high, it's going to be different on test day, of course. With the adrenaline of the test, you might slip a little bit, but you have to know how to pick up the pieces afterwards. So when you go through a game, do you do the questions in the order given?
Right now during practice, I do.
Okay.
I'm familiar with the idea of skipping, but I'm following your 3-month schedule, so I'm just doing it straight for now.
Okay, yeah. So you could do the games in a particular order. Let's say the 4 games within a single section. You could do those 4 games in order. But I'm saying the questions within a single logic game. And you'll see this in my videos too. I don't always do the questions in order. I might sometimes say, we're on question 18 right now, but I'm going to skip it and come back to it later. And then the work from question 22 might help me solve question 18. And so let's say there's a case where you have your orientation question, then a global, then a local. I would say do orientation, local, then global, because the work from the local could help you solve the global. And you want to solve all the questions in the end, of course, but the order in which you solve them is somewhat arbitrary, and the order in which they're presented is somewhat arbitrary. So I'm saying maybe you can flip things around a little bit. So if you did not get a particular inference up front, or just some random global must be true thing they're asking you, you could save it for the end and use all your previous diagrams up to that point as evidence to help you solve the global. Because you have your orientation question, your valid scenario there. You have maybe 2 to 3 local questions. So you already have 3 to 4 valid diagrams available to you to help you potentially eliminate wrong answers in the global question later. How does that idea strike you of like changing the order around a little bit? I know you're familiar with it, but have you tried it?
Not on purpose. Like sometimes if a question give me a trouble, I'll go on. But I have never skipped one. I read the questions to them and said, let's go on. I probably should though. Try
it out. There's really no downside to changing your approach a little bit. You've got enough time before the exam that you could play around a little bit with this. Maybe do 3 to 5 games sections in this way where you give yourself the gift of that flexibility and see how it works out for you.
Another thing that I noticed that you do a lot and it works for you is the multiple diagrams. I emailed you about it. I'm trying to copy it. It definitely, having those diagrams, you breeze through the questions, but I never know like when to stop. Like sometimes you look at a question and you could make endless diagrams, and then but just unnecessary. So I'm just trying to there's some sort of trick. Today in one of your logic explanations, you said that if it doesn't have so many local questions, it might be an indication that there's multiple diagrams. But that was the only hint that I got from you, that there's some sort of hint.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy thing to hold on to. When do you make multiple diagrams? When do you not? I get this question like at least once a week from students asking, what's the secret? How do you know when? Because it's so awesome when you can make multiple diagrams and break the game wide open. And there are other cases where it just is not the tool for the job. A lot of it comes from practice, but I can give you another little hint, which is that when there's a particularly influential variable or influential rule that's powerful or limiting in some way, you can use that particular variable or rule as a wedge to help you split the game open into a couple of major possibilities. So let's say if you have one particular variable that appears in multiple rules, putting that variable in a couple of places could be, if those are the only places it could be, that might break the game open. So let's say if we had that A is either on 1 or A is on 2, and it was limited to only those 2 slots, or if it was A is on 1, 2, or 3 to those 3 slots, you place A on each of those 3 slots in 3 different main diagrams, and you see the other variables that fall into place around it. It might be limiting enough that every valid scenario falling within one of those 3 is a good jumping off point for you. Like A being on 1, 2, or 3, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever the case may be. It could be influential enough when combined with the other cascading inferences that result. Like if A was immediately before B, or immediately after B, or 2 spaces before B, whatever the case may be. So it's about how the rules interact. But if you can note a key variable or block of variables, that can be powerful.
So just practice.
Yeah, it is practice, but I think start off by looking for this, particularly in simple ordering games, and work from there. I have an article related to this, and if you email me, I'll send you a link to it where I walk through a drill showing you how this could be really powerful in a simple example. And this technique can work for main diagrams for a game in general. It can also work for helping you draw multiple main diagrams for an individual local question. Either way, if you see all the scenarios up front, all the possibilities up front, then you will automatically know at a glance, like having a bird's eye view of what could be true and what must be true and what cannot be true, because you have everything in front.
Right.
You want to be methodical about it. So when you're drawing multiple main diagrams for a game, the key is to have a systematic approach to how you're drawing them. Not that you're just drawing several diagrams that all happen to be valid. It's that this is a general framework into which all valid scenarios must fall. So you don't need to have all your main diagrams fully fleshed out with every single variable filled in and every single slot filled in. It's more about knowing that these are the 2 or 3 or maybe 4 roads you can go down, and you can flesh out those diagrams in more detail when you need to or when you want to for a specific local question. But they don't need to be fully filled out. A lot of times for my multiple main diagrams, I'll have half the slots empty, but what I filled in is a good skeleton to move forward from later. Now, I know that you had a question about a specific logic game. We could talk a little bit about that one as well from Test 59.
It was just a specific question. I obviously read the answer choices wrong. And
it was about variables being immediately before and immediately after others, right?
Right. So the question was, which of the following must be false? And then it gave a lot of choices. So it said, let's say Los Angeles is used either immediately before or immediately after New York.
Right.
So I understood the question to mean if that was a rule given, can it possibly be true? Means can Los Angeles be only placed in those two spots, or is it allowed to be placed elsewhere?
Well,
that's obviously not what it meant.
Well, they're saying immediately before or immediately after New York, meaning that L, so we'll say for short, L and N, Los Angeles and New York.
Right.
L and N are consecutive, but they can be consecutive in either order. But this is not limiting them to a particular slot, of course. They just must appear consecutively. So nothing else would go in between them.
Right. But I understood the question to mean that if L and N do not have to be consecutive, then it must be false. Because the question was, which one must be false? And the answer was L is either before or after New York. It means they have to be consecutive.
I see what you're saying. So the question,
that's not what the question meant.
No, the question is saying which one of the following in general must be false, meaning that if A were correct in this instance, that would mean that L and N could never be consecutive if A is correct. But of course, there are 5 choices here. So in 4 of these choices, those 2 variables could be consecutive. And there's only one pairing of variables that could never be consecutive. But it's not saying that they have to be consecutive.
Right. Why not? You're for sure right. I know you're right. But the question is why not based on the wording? Why doesn't that mean that they have to be consecutive? Because it says L is used either immediately before or immediately after. That means I understood it to mean only can be used there before or after. So that's where I'm going wrong. Since it doesn't say only used before or after, it means it's allowed to be used before or after.
Correct. Yeah. So I think I get what you're saying here. So L could be immediately before or immediately after New York. If it could, then A is wrong. But they're not saying it must.
I think I finally got it.
Okay, awesome.
I got 2 correct answers, and that's where I knew I was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as an exercise, I don't love negative phrasing. I think negative phrasing is much more confusing than positive phrasing. So in a case like this where they say must be false, I would immediately rephrase it as could be true. I would find the 4 choices that could be true and then eliminate them. So if I have even one previous example where L and N have been consecutive in either order, then I know I can eliminate A. And then I'm not worrying about the negative phrasing at all. I just work through the 5 choices, eliminate what I can, and whatever remains, if it cannot happen, then it's my answer.
All right, thank you. I got that.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. Now I know you had a couple of other questions here I think we could address in the short time remaining. So you were concerned about burnout with the games.
Right. So I was wondering if you would recommend perhaps switching to another topic for a little bit, or you'd say just worth,
Absolutely. You don't want to spend too much time on any one question type because you could get fatigued on it, and you also don't want to run out of time to cover the others. So if you've been working on games exclusively for a while and you're getting bored of it, or you want to change it up a little bit, or you just want to get your feet wet in logical reasoning, dive in, do a bit of LR as well. And you'll notice that in the schedule, when I have you start logical reasoning, I still mix in games as well so that you don't get rusty on them. And then you can keep working on any weak areas if there's a certain game type you still want extra practice on. And then when you go into reading comp, still mix in games, still mix in logical reasoning as well. But you want to build up. And since games is typically the most unfamiliar and daunting at first, I like to start there because it is the lowest hanging fruit. Typically people are getting less than half correct initially because they're so unfamiliar. But with time, of course, you can achieve perfection on them.
Right. I also like games because they're 100% perfectible.
Exactly. You don't have the ambiguities of language there. It's mathematical almost.
And you almost know immediately if you got it wrong.
Right.
Sometimes I can't figure it out, but I know where I'm going wrong. Whereas in logical reasoning, you think you're right and then you're not.
Yeah. Yeah. The vocabulary, the language, the ambiguity, it's a mess. Very tricky. And so that kind of ties into the last question you sent me about 170 score mindset. Like, what does it take? And I think it does take seeing LSAC's phrasings and reading between the lines or looking underneath the disguise of logical reasoning, because it is half the exam, and seeing the skeleton of the method of reasoning behind the topic. Because as we said earlier, topic never matters. It's the structure that matters. And so if you could see how a method of reasoning in an argument on climate change could relate to a method of reasoning about dinosaur extinction or heart disease. And so it's the methods of reasoning, I think, that really trip students up much more than the topics do. You can get distracted by the topics, but if you don't know the method of reasoning, you don't really know anything. And so I want you to analyze during your review process, what was it about a particular method of reasoning that you might not have gotten. And of course, to encourage you to be skeptical of all of these methods of reasoning, not to take them at face value.
Right. One thing I did find helpful, you mentioned to write your own logic game. I'm not quite holding there, but adding a question to a logic game is something I can sometimes do and gives me like a little bit of a focus.
Awesome. Yeah, that's something I've had a lot of fun with as well, just writing supplemental questions to actual games.
Right. So you suggested that not writing a full game, it takes a whole new level of skill, but just the supplemental question is possible, and that is helpful.
Totally. And then another thing you could do with logical reasoning is, let's say for a flaw question, they have 5 choices and they're abstractly worded in terms of the general flaw, the general method of reasoning, not specific to the topic. What you could do as an exercise is try to imagine or even rewrite, what would that argument look like if it were committing a different flaw instead? So instead of committing an ad hominem fallacy, what if it was confusing necessary sufficient or correlation causation? It takes a little bit of creativity, but I think it's interesting to make sure and like solidify your understanding of what that abstract language was referencing in terms of the flaw. Because although 4 of those are wrong this time, each of them will be right on a different question in the future. So you have to know what they're asking. You have to know what it's talking about, what it's describing. And then another thing I would encourage you to do if you're looking to get into the 170 plus category is to really try and see the exam from the test maker's perspective, not only from looking at games and reasoning like this, but thinking about how is the exam structured? Why is it created the way it is in terms of different questions having different levels of difficulty? Like what does it take to create a level 5 difficulty question? How many various traps are they including in that question? Because it's like a question could be hard for 3 or 4 different reasons. They've all combined as like to create the ultimate difficult question. And so I had a few discussions on my YouTube channel and podcast with a former writer of actual LSAT questions. And I highly recommend that you check this out. I'll send you the links.
So I read your interview with him. I didn't know you have a podcast.
Yeah, so
we had an interview with someone.
Yeah, so we did some discussion interviews in the past that were written for him, but I've since done I got him on camera doing YouTube videos with me. And so we've got some YouTube discussions as well. And I would definitely encourage you to watch those or listen to them because he has a unique level of insight that obviously very few people do.
Right.
But ultimately, a lot of it comes down to being critical and skeptical of arguments. So a lot of times the lowest scorer will be overconfident in assuming or thinking they can infer more than they actually can. And the top scorers, they realize how limited the information in front of them is and how little one can actually infer. They're always problematizing and complicating things, right? And so it's like the wise man thinks he's a fool and the fool thinks he's wise. Like you want to have that approach to this where you realize how little you can really infer. So anyway, Moshe, I think we're out of time, but I hope you found this helpful.
So much.
Of course, my pleasure. Is there anything else you would need to feel complete for today?
I was wondering how the group tutoring works. I don't know if this is the format for asking that.
Yeah, sure. We could talk about that a little bit. So what I'm doing is not really group tutoring. It's more of a coaching mastermind group where we're not going over individual questions and explanations and things like that. We're looking deeper. We're looking bigger picture at the things that are holding you back with your prep, with your schedule, with your studying approach. Because obviously there's millions of explanations out there. I've made explanations. Others have made explanations. I think there's a surplus of explanations of individual LSAT problems. But I think what we can really benefit from in terms of coaching conversations in this setting is to learn from the experiences of others, but also to help you see your own blind spots in terms of what could you be doing differently with your approach to the exam. Because obviously there's study plans out there. I've made many study plans, but they're one size fits all in a way. And we need to customize things to your individual situation sometimes and help you figure out what you should be doing differently in terms of your approach, whether it's working on a different question type or working on your review process differently, or where you would start in terms of writing your own games or own reasoning questions or your own explanations to look at the exam on a deeper level. And so that's what the coaching is really about.
Is there a specific level I should have reached in my prep before I would begin the coaching?
I would say that you certainly want to have a general understanding of the different question types, just a basic foundation level of what are the various types of games, what are the various types of logical reasoning questions, the various reading comprehension passage topics and types and questions. But once you have that foundation, that basic familiarity, that would be sufficient, I think. You want to have an idea of your weak areas and you want to have questions about that you want to cover with me.
Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. It's really nice meeting you. I appreciate taking the time to do this.
My pleasure, Moshe. Absolutely. It was great to connect with you, and I look forward to seeing your progress along the way.